If nobody needs you, then why are you still sitting here? The words hung in the air like something no one at the table knew how to take back. Ethan Carter didn't speak. He just held his fork halfway between his plate and his mouth, then slowly set it down as if the simple act of eating had suddenly become optional in a room where he no longer felt invited to exist. Across the polished oak dining table sat his father, Robert Carter, a man who valued silence only when it came from control, not discomfort. Next to him, his mother, Linda Carter, folded her hands tightly, her expression carefully arranged into something that looked like disappointment but carried the sharper edge of finality. The dinner table was set perfectly, as it always was on Sundays in the Carter household, with roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans placed with almost ceremonial precision. Yet the atmosphere felt nothing like a family gathering and everything like a verdict being delivered. Ethan had grown up in this house learning how to take up less space, how to speak only when spoken to, how to turn ambition into something quieter so it wouldn't disturb the hierarchy already established long before he understood what that word meant. His older brother, Daniel, had already secured his place in the family narrative as the successful one, the one who made Robert Carter nod with pride instead of critique, while Ethan had become the comparison that never favored him. Still, he had shown up tonight, as he always did when asked, because showing up had become its own kind of habit, even when it no longer felt like belonging. "Nobody needs you here," Robert said again, this time slower, as if repeating it would turn it into truth that could settle more comfortably in the room. Linda didn't stop him, which somehow said more than the words themselves. Ethan felt something shift inside him, not anger, not sadness, but a strange kind of clarity, like a fog lifting from a road he had been walking for years without realizing it was leading nowhere he wanted to stay. He looked around the table, noticing details he had ignored for too long. The way Daniel didn't meet his eyes, the way the house felt too big for conversation but too small for escape, the way even the clinking of silverware sounded like it belonged to someone else's life. And then, unexpectedly, Ethan smiled. It wasn't loud or performative, it wasn't sarcastic or defensive. It was calm, almost polite, the kind of smile that didn't ask for permission and didn't require understanding. For a brief moment, the room didn't know how to respond to it, as if they had been prepared for arguments, silence, or even tears, but not acceptance. Robert frowned slightly, unsettled by the absence of reaction he expected to control. Linda's eyes narrowed just a fraction, searching for something she could correct, but finding nothing to fix. Ethan slowly pushed his chair back just an inch, not enough to disrupt the table, but enough to signal that something had already shifted beyond it. He stood up with the same calmness he had used to smile, adjusted his sleeves, and looked once around the table as if memorizing a place he had already started leaving in his mind long before his body moved. No one stopped him. No one asked him to stay. And that silence, more than anything said aloud that night, became the moment everything began to change. The silence that followed Ethan's smile did not end when he left the dining room. It followed him through the long hallway of the Carter house, where every step felt unusually loud against the hardwood floor that had once felt familiar. He did not rush, yet he did not hesitate either, as if his body had already agreed to a decision his mind had been avoiding for years. Behind him, the dining room remained unchanged, the table still perfectly set, the food still warm, and yet something essential had shifted in a way no one at the table seemed ready to name. Robert Carter remained seated, staring at the space Ethan had just occupied, his expression controlled but no longer fully confident, as though the certainty he usually carried had been slightly disturbed. Linda Carter broke the silence first, asking in a careful voice where Ethan thought he was going. But even she did not sound like she expected an answer that would bring him back. Ethan paused at the entrance of the hallway, not turning around immediately, and when he finally did, his expression carried no anger, no pleading, only a calm distance that felt unfamiliar in a house built on emotional hierarchy. He said nothing dramatic, only that he needed time. Words so simple, they almost sounded inadequate for the weight of what had just occurred, and yet they were final in a way no one could easily challenge in that moment. Daniel Carter, who had spent most of the dinner avoiding involvement, finally looked up, but even he did not know what to say, because the version of Ethan standing there did not match the version he had quietly accepted for years. Ethan then continued walking, and with each step away from the dining room, he felt less like he was leaving a place and more like he was leaving a role he had never truly chosen. Upstairs in his room, the environment was almost painfully ordinary: a bed neatly made, a desk with a closed laptop, a few books aligned along the edge, all signs of a life that had been organized but not lived fully. He stood in the center of the room for a moment, noticing how quiet it was compared to the dining room below, as if the house itself had different levels of acceptance depending on where one stood. Slowly, he sat at the edge of the bed and placed his hands together, not in prayer or frustration, but in a kind of quiet calculation, as if trying to understand when exactly silence had replaced dialogue in his life. He thought about the dinner, the sentence that had been spoken so casually, yet carried such finality, and he realized it was not the first time he had been made to feel unnecessary, only the first time it had been said without disguise. Outside his window, the evening light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the lawn of the Carter property, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not feel compelled to interpret those shadows as temporary. He opened his laptop, not to escape, but to begin something he had never fully committed to before, something undefined but no longer negotiable in his mind. There was no dramatic declaration, no visible turning point from the outside, only a quiet shift that would not be noticed by anyone still downstairs, where dinner continued without him as if nothing essential had changed. Yet inside that room, something irreversible had already begun forming, not in anger, but in clarity, and that clarity felt more powerful than anything he had ever been told he lacked. The first night after that dinner felt unusually long for Ethan Carter, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did, and that absence of noise inside his life felt more noticeable than any argument he had ever been part of in the Carter household. Downstairs, the house continued its normal rhythm, the sound of dishes being cleared, the television in the living room playing softly, and occasional conversation between Robert Carter and Linda Carter about ordinary matters that no longer seemed to include him in any meaningful way. Ethan remained in his room upstairs, where the light from his laptop screen became the only steady presence in an otherwise quiet space. He was not searching for distraction, and he was not trying to prove anything in that moment. Instead, he was observing something he had never fully committed to understanding before: the structure of his own life outside the expectations of the family that had defined it for so long. Hours passed without him noticing, as he reviewed information, made notes, and organized thoughts that had previously been scattered and unimportant, each action small on its own, but collectively forming something new and deliberate. At some point in the night, his phone lit up with a message from his mother asking only if he was coming down in the morning for breakfast, written in a tone that carried no apology and no acknowledgement of what had happened earlier, as if the dinner had been a moment that belonged to a version of reality that could be easily set aside. Ethan read the message more than once before placing the phone face down on the bed, not out of anger, but because he understood that responding would only pull him back into a pattern he had just begun to recognize as limiting. The next morning arrived with sunlight filtering through the curtains in a way that made everything appear normal. Again, and for a brief moment, the house almost convinced itself that nothing had changed. Robert Carter was already downstairs reading a newspaper at the dining table, and Linda Carter was preparing coffee as she always did, both of them maintaining the familiar structure of the household without referencing the previous night. When Ethan finally came down, the atmosphere shifted slightly, not because anyone said anything immediately, but because expectations collided with uncertainty in a way that made simple interactions feel heavier than usual. Robert glanced at him briefly, then returned to the newspaper without comment, while Linda offered a greeting that sounded carefully neutral, as if she were testing whether the previous night should be treated as resolved or ignored. Ethan responded politely, but without the usual attempt to fit himself into the emotional rhythm of the room, and that difference was subtle enough to go unchallenged, but noticeable enough to change the way he was perceived. Breakfast proceeded with minimal conversation, yet the silence felt different from the one they were used to, less like comfort and more like distance that had not yet been named. After eating, Ethan returned to his room without waiting for instructions or invitations, and this time no one stopped him or asked where he was going, which in itself confirmed something that had already begun to settle between them. Inside his room, he continued what he had started the night before, not as a reaction to conflict, but as the beginning of a consistent direction he had finally allowed himself to take seriously. There was no announcement, no confrontation, and no dramatic decision shared with the household. Only a gradual withdrawal that looked ordinary from the outside, but carried a completely different meaning on the inside. By the end of that day, Ethan Carter was still physically present in the house, but emotionally and mentally, he had already started building something separate from it, something that did not rely on approval, recognition, or permission from anyone downstairs. Over the next few days, the Carter household settled back into its familiar structure, but something about it no longer felt stable to Ethan Carter, even though on the surface everything appeared unchanged. Robert Carter continued his routine of early mornings and structured work calls from his home office, while Linda Carter maintained the household with her usual precision, as if order itself could prevent any unresolved tension from becoming visible. Daniel Carter came and went with little acknowledgement of Ethan, maintaining the quiet distance he had always preferred, but now that distance felt less like neutrality and more like confirmation of separation. Ethan, however, no longer moved through the house in the same way. He still followed the same physical paths, still occupied the same room, still sat at the same table when required, but his presence had shifted into something less dependent on interaction and more focused on independence. He spent long hours working on his laptop, not in a way that anyone in the house could clearly interpret, but with a consistency that suggested structure rather than distraction. There were no explanations offered, and none were requested, which created an unusual equilibrium where absence of conflict replaced the expectation of communication. One afternoon, Linda Carter entered his room briefly while he was working and asked if he had considered applying for positions more aligned with what Robert had once recommended, her tone careful, but still carrying the assumption that guidance from the family remained the natural direction for his decisions. Ethan paused only for a moment before responding that he was already working on something, though he did not elaborate, and the lack of detail left the conversation unresolved in a way that Linda did not pursue further. She left the room with a polite acknowledgement, but the expression on her face suggested confusion rather than satisfaction, as if she had encountered behavior that did not fit the expectations she had relied on for years. That evening, Robert Carter mentioned Ethan only once at dinner, asking Linda in a passing tone whether he was still spending most of his time upstairs, a question that carried less curiosity and more uncertainty about whether distance should now be interpreted as concern or indifference. Linda replied that he was keeping to himself but seemed focused, and Robert did not respond further, returning instead to the conversation about work matters that no longer included Ethan in any practical sense. Meanwhile, Ethan continued building what had begun in the quiet hours after that dinner, not with urgency, but with steady intention that grew stronger the less it was observed. He began organizing ideas into a structured plan that required attention and discipline, and for the first time in a long while, he felt that his time was not being measured by comparison to anyone else in the house. The house itself remained unchanged in appearance, the same furniture, the same routines, the same conversations, yet Ethan's relationship to it was no longer defined by acceptance or rejection. Instead, it became something observational, as if he were slowly stepping outside of a system he had once assumed was permanent. Each day that passed without confrontation reinforced a quiet realization within him that he did not need permission to continue moving forward, and that absence of recognition did not equal absence of value. By the end of the week, Ethan Carter was still present within the Carter household, but his sense of belonging had already begun to exist somewhere else entirely, forming a separation that no one had officially declared, yet everyone was beginning to feel in ways they could not yet fully articulate. 2 weeks after that dinner, the atmosphere inside the Carter household had not changed in any visible way, yet the emotional structure beneath it had shifted so significantly that even ordinary conversations felt slightly misaligned. Ethan Carter continued to move through the house with the same quiet consistency, but now there was a noticeable difference in how often he was observed and how little he was interrupted. Robert Carter had begun to notice that Ethan no longer waited for approval before making decisions about his time, and although he did not comment directly, there were moments when his gaze lingered longer than before, as if trying to understand a version of his son that no longer fit the expectations he had built over the years. Linda Carter maintained her usual routines, but she occasionally paused when passing Ethan's room, as though uncertain whether to enter or whether doing so would disrupt a new boundary that had not been formally discussed but was already understood. Daniel Carter, who typically avoided emotional involvement, became more visibly aware of the shift, not through conversation but through observation, noticing that Ethan no longer reacted to family discussions in the same passive way he once had. One evening, during a routine dinner where conversations centered on unrelated topics, Robert mentioned a professional connection who had recently discussed opportunities in a growing field of digital consulting, and for the first time, Ethan did not simply listen quietly or disengage. Instead, he made a brief, calm comment that he had already been exploring similar areas, delivered in a tone that was neither defensive nor seeking validation. The statement was simple, but it created a subtle pause at the table because it suggested direction without permission and progress without announcement. Linda responded with a measured question about what exactly he meant, but Ethan only stated that he preferred to continue developing it before discussing details, and the conversation naturally shifted away without resolution. Later that night, Robert remained in his study longer than usual, reviewing documents he had already finished earlier, as if his attention had been pulled back towards something he had not fully processed. Meanwhile, Ethan continued working upstairs with the same steady focus he had maintained since that night when everything had shifted, but now his efforts were beginning to take clearer shape, forming a structure that was no longer abstract or temporary. He had begun organizing external contacts, studying frameworks, and refining a direction that required consistency rather than approval, and each step reinforced a growing independence that no longer depended on recognition from within the house. Over time, small changes became more noticeable. Ethan began receiving occasional phone calls that he did not take in front of the family, and when asked casually, he explained only that they were related to his work, without offering further detail. These moments did not create confrontation, but they gradually introduced uncertainty into the household dynamic, because the lack of information made interpretation difficult for those who had once defined him so clearly. Robert Carter, in particular, found himself reconsidering assumptions he had held for years, not through any direct challenge, but through the quiet persistence of Ethan's behavior, which no longer aligned with the version of him that had been easiest to categorize. Linda, on the other hand, attempted at times to re-establish conversational familiarity, asking about his plans in a tone that suggested a return to earlier patterns might still be possible, but Ethan's responses remained calm, measured, and increasingly self-directed. By the end of the second week, the change was no longer something that could be dismissed as temporary distance or emotional reaction. It had become a consistent state, one in which Ethan Carter was still physically present in the family home, but no longer emotionally defined by it, and that realization, though unspoken, had begun to settle across the household in ways that none of them were yet fully prepared to address. By the third week, the change in Ethan Carter's life had moved beyond subtle behavior shifts and into something that could no longer be explained away as temporary distance or emotional adjustment. Inside the Carter household, routines continued as always, but Ethan's presence within those routines had become increasingly minimal, not through conflict or declaration, but through a quiet reordering of priorities that no one had formally agreed to but everyone was beginning to recognize. Robert Carter had started to notice that Ethan was no longer available at predictable times, no longer present for casual conversations, and no longer responsive to assumptions about shared family schedules. These absences were not disruptive in a traditional sense, yet they created a sense of imbalance that Robert did not openly acknowledge, even to himself. Linda Carter, meanwhile, continued to maintain the household structure, but she began asking more frequent questions about Ethan's plans, not in an interrogative way, but with a tone that suggested a growing awareness that she was no longer fully informed about his daily life. Ethan, however, remained consistent in his responses, offering only brief explanations that referenced ongoing work commitments without providing unnecessary detail. and this restraint created a gap between what the family knew and what they could understand. One afternoon, Robert received a brief message from an old colleague mentioning a small industry event where emerging digital projects were being discussed, and to his surprise, Ethan mentioned later that he had already registered for a similar event taking place in the same city, scheduled for the following week. The statement was delivered casually during a late dinner conversation, yet it carried an impact that lingered longer than expected because it revealed movement outside the family's awareness rather than within it. Linda asked whether this meant he was planning a career change, but Ethan responded calmly that he was simply following a direction he had already been developing, without framing it as a decision that required approval or debate. That night, after the household had gone quiet, Robert remained in his study longer than usual, not working, but reviewing earlier thoughts about Ethan's trajectory, as if trying to reconcile the version of his son he had always assumed with the one that was now unfolding independently. Daniel Carter, who rarely engaged in family matters, made a passing comment the next morning that Ethan seemed different lately, but even he did not elaborate, suggesting that the change was visible enough to be acknowledged but not yet understood. Ethan himself spent most of his time outside the house during the following days, attending meetings, researching opportunities, and engaging with environments that no longer centered around the Carter household in any meaningful way. He returned home later in the evenings, often after dinner had already ended, and when he did, his presence was quiet, focused, and increasingly self-contained. There was no announcement of departure, no confrontation about separation, and no emotional rupture that could be clearly identified as the moment things changed, yet the distance between Ethan and the rest of the family had become structurally real rather than emotionally implied. Linda attempted once more to engage him in a longer conversation, asking whether he would be home more regularly in the coming weeks, but Ethan only stated that his schedule was becoming more demanding, and the conversation ended without further pursuit. Robert did not intervene, but his observation of Ethan had become more frequent, as if trying to understand whether this independence represented a phase or a permanent transformation. By the end of the third week, Ethan Carter's life had clearly extended beyond the boundaries of the household, and while he had not officially left, his identity within the family had already begun to dissolve into something more distant, more autonomous, and no longer defined by the expectations that had once governed every aspect of his place at the table. By the fourth week, the change that had been forming around Ethan Carter had reached a point where it could no longer be understood as simple distance or temporary independence, because it had become a consistent reality that affected every interaction within the household, even when nothing was said directly about it. The Carter home continued to function with its usual structure, meals prepared at familiar times, conversations maintained with careful neutrality, and routines preserved in a way that suggested stability. Yet beneath that surface, Ethan's absence from the emotional center of the family had become unmistakable. Robert Carter found himself observing Ethan more frequently during the limited times they shared the same space, not with confrontation, but with a growing awareness that Ethan no longer responded to the household in predictable ways. Linda Carter, who had once assumed that proximity naturally meant involvement, began to notice that Ethan's presence in the home no longer translated into participation in its emotional or conversational rhythm. Daniel Carter remained largely detached, but even he occasionally remarked in passing that Ethan seemed fully absorbed in something outside the family, though he never asked for details. Ethan himself had entered a phase of sustained external engagement that took him away from the house for extended periods during the day, often returning late in the evening with a quiet focus that suggested his attention was no longer anchored in the household's expectations. He attended professional gatherings in the city, participated in structured discussions, and spent long hours working through plans that were no longer theoretical but increasingly practical in nature. These activities were not announced or explained in detail to the family, which created a growing informational gap that Robert in particular found difficult to ignore. One evening, during a brief moment when Ethan returned earlier than usual, Robert asked him in a calm but direct tone whether these new commitments were becoming a permanent direction in his life, and Ethan responded without hesitation that he was building something that required full attention and consistency, regardless of how it aligned with previous expectations. The answer was not confrontational, but it was definitive enough to shift the emotional balance of the conversation, because it made clear that Ethan's trajectory was no longer dependent on family interpretation or approval. Linda attempted to ask whether this meant he was distancing himself from the household, but Ethan simply stated that he was not rejecting anything, only moving forward with what he had already started, and the lack of emotional framing in his response left the question unresolved. After that conversation, the household entered a quieter phase, not because tension increased, but because uncertainty replaced assumption as the default condition of interaction. Robert spent more time reflecting privately on Ethan's development, not in terms of opposition, but in terms of incompleteness, as if trying to identify the point at which familiarity had shifted into something less accessible. Linda continued her routines, but her questions became less frequent, replaced by observation rather than engagement, suggesting a gradual acceptance that Ethan's life was no longer structured around shared expectations. Ethan, meanwhile, continued expanding his external commitments, and each new engagement reinforced a pattern of independence that no longer required explanation to function. He was still physically present within the home at times, but his identity within it had already transformed into something secondary, no longer defined by family roles or inherited expectations. By the end of the 4th week, the Carter household remained intact in structure, but fundamentally altered in emotional alignment. Because Ethan Carter had not left, but he was no longer positioned within it in the way he once had been, and that distinction had begun to reshape how every member of the family understood both him and themselves. By the 5th week, the transformation that had been slowly unfolding around Ethan Carter reached a point where it was no longer something the family could interpret through familiar patterns, because his life had clearly established a structure that existed independently of the Carter household. The home itself remained unchanged in appearance, the same dining room, the same routines, the same carefully maintained order, yet Ethan's connection to it had become increasingly symbolic rather than functional. Robert Carter had begun to recognize that Ethan's schedule was no longer aligned with the household in any practical sense, as his departures in the morning and returns in the evening followed a pattern that was entirely self-directed. Linda Carter, who once relied on shared routines as a measure of family connection, found herself adjusting to a reality in which Ethan's presence could no longer be assumed or integrated into daily expectations. Daniel Carter, observing from a distance, noted only in passing that Ethan seemed fully occupied with external commitments, but even his casual remarks carried an undertone of acknowledgement that something irreversible had taken shape. Ethan himself continued operating within this new structure without hesitation, attending meetings, developing professional relationships, and dedicating extended hours to work that was now producing visible outcomes beyond the household. There was no announcement of departure, no formal separation, and no moment that could be identified as a clear break, yet the effect was the same as if he had already stepped into an entirely different environment. One evening, during a rare instance when all members of the family were present for dinner, Robert attempted to engage Ethan in conversation about his long-term direction, asking in a measured tone whether he intended to continue on this current path indefinitely or eventually return to something more aligned with traditional expectations. Ethan responded calmly that what he was building required full commitment and could not be shaped around prior assumptions. And although his tone remained respectful, the content of his response made it clear that his decisions were no longer subject to negotiation within the family context. Linda followed with a quieter question about whether he still considered the house to be his primary base, but Ethan replied that while he respected the home, his work and responsibilities were now structured elsewhere, and that distinction created a silence at the table that lasted longer than any of them typically allowed. Robert did not press further, but his expression reflected a recognition that Ethan's position within the family system had fundamentally changed, not through conflict, but through sustained independence. After that dinner, interactions between Ethan and the rest of the household became increasingly limited to brief exchanges that focused on logistics rather than emotion or expectation. Ethan's presence in shared spaces grew less frequent, and when he did appear, it was with a calm detachment that no longer invited interpretation or assumption. Linda gradually reduced her attempts to inquire about his plans, shifting instead toward observation, as if adjusting to a new version of her son that could not be easily accessed through conversation. Robert, on the other hand, found himself reflecting more privately on the progression of events, not with resistance, but with a growing awareness that Ethan's development had followed a trajectory that the family had not anticipated or guided. By the end of the 5th week, Ethan Carter's life had become fully self-sustaining outside the internal structure of the household, and although he had not formally left, his role within the family had effectively transitioned into something distant and autonomous, leaving behind a home that remained physically intact but emotionally redefined by his absence from its center. By the 6th week, the change that had been building around Ethan Carter reached a point where it was no longer defined by gradual adjustment, but by clear and undeniable separation in every meaningful sense except physical presence. The Carter household continued its routines, but those routines now functioned independently of Ethan's involvement, as if the family system had quietly adapted to his absence without formally acknowledging it. Robert Carter had stopped expecting Ethan to be consistently present for meals or casual discussions, and instead observed his movements with a more detached awareness, recognizing that Ethan's schedule now operated on priorities that originated entirely outside the home. Linda Carter, who had once tried to maintain conversational connection, had shifted into a quieter form of understanding, where questions were no longer asked as frequently, and assumptions about shared daily life had been replaced by observation and restraint. Daniel Carter remained largely uninvolved, but even his occasional presence carried a subtle recognition that Ethan's role within the family was no longer defined by participation, but by distance. Ethan himself continued to move with consistent focus, and by this point his external commitments had become stable enough that they structured his entire routine, leaving only limited and increasingly optional interaction with the household. One evening, Robert requested that Ethan join him briefly in the study, not with urgency, but with a tone that suggested a desire for clarity rather than confrontation. When Ethan entered, Robert began by acknowledging that he had noticed significant changes in Ethan's direction over the past several weeks, and asked whether this path represented a temporary phase or a permanent shift away from the family's expectations. Ethan responded calmly that what he was building was not temporary, and that it had reached a level where returning to previous assumptions about his role was no longer practical or relevant. His words were measured, without emotional emphasis, but their meaning carried finality that did not invite negotiation. Linda, who had joined the conversation quietly, asked whether this meant he no longer considered the household part of his life structure, and Ethan replied that while he respected the home and the family, his life had developed into a separate framework that required full independence to function. The silence that followed was not tense, but reflective, as if each person in the room was processing the same realization from different perspectives. Robert eventually acknowledged that he understood Ethan's position, even if it was not the direction he had expected, and there was no further attempt to challenge or redirect the conversation. In the days that followed, Ethan's presence in the household became increasingly minimal, not through conflict or departure, but through natural alignment with a life that no longer intersected regularly with the family's internal rhythm. He continued his work without interruption, and his commitments outside the home became the primary structure of his time, leaving only occasional moments of physical return that carried no expectation of participation in family routines. Linda observed this change with quiet acceptance, no longer attempting to integrate Ethan into conversations that had lost their shared context, while Robert maintained a similar distance, focusing instead on understanding the outcome rather than influencing its direction. By the end of this period, Ethan Carter's transformation was no longer something unfolding within the family system, but something that had already completed its separation, leaving behind a household that remained intact in form but fundamentally altered in meaning, as Ethan's place within it had shifted from central to observational, and finally to something that existed almost entirely outside its structure.